think I've done it. All right, folks, if I can sort of call us back to attention here. Sorry, we're running a little bit behind schedule, but there was some great discussion going on in some of the breakout sessions, and we wanted to let it sort of work its natural course out. To me, this afternoon has fallen the task of trying to summarize everything that happened in all three rooms in the last 45 minutes. Please bear with me if I don't get your favorite comment worked in or if I miss high points. I've asked a trio of folks to help me with reporting out of each of these rooms. I'd like to introduce Brian Ambrette from the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, Mike Hardesty from Washington College Center for Environment and Society, and Professor Rebecca Fox, also from Washington College, and thank them for helping me this afternoon. And if I stumble on the particulars, please feel free to point it out. I ghosted through all three sessions, and I was really enthused that what I heard was really shades of the same conversation. I heard different details in each room, but what I heard, broadly speaking, was that there's a great conversation going on about three different parts of adaptation to climate change and sea level rise in particular. There is a great synthetic discussion going on between the need for resiliency, the need for accurate, good, and scientifically sound prediction, and the need for scientifically based and popularly accepted and politically motivated mitigation and remediation efforts. So the dynamic between those three pieces of the conversation, I think, was rich in all three rooms. And so I wanted to sort of go about a very, very brief summary of what we heard from each of these. So up here on the main stage was Zoe Johnson's session from DNR and the CoastSmart program. And as I sat through the first 5 minutes, I heard a call for that good information. I heard a call for the information that helps with prediction. And in particular, she solicited questions from the audience that ran the gamut from what are evolving policies at insurance companies, what do we need to do in terms of networking? What is the role of the county comprehensive plans? What is the role of federal policy and regional policy in setting the best practices? What is the way to mitigate the cost of this, and what mechanisms are available? What is the expected loss? What does the science tell us is at risk here? And I think the loudest call I heard from that group was for a definition of resiliency itself, which really played well into Zoe's talk because the first slide was a definition of resiliency that I really like. She and her colleagues at DNR define resiliency as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and adapt to what's coming. And that's not an exact translation, but I think it's fairly close. And I think good resiliency and good policy that helps us to do that is going to need to take care of all of the talking points in that definition. So my understanding then is that the rest of that session in this room ran through basically high-level strategy implementation and high-level tools that are available to help communities plan for the coming changes. And I asked for a couple of highlights from the report out, and among the things that stuck with the folks who were listening was a state Coastal Smart Communities Scorecard, which is a self-assessment tool for communities to assess their own vulnerability and start planning for sea level rise. And there's an encouragement from that group that if you are interested in using that tool in your community, that your local elected community needs to be on board with that. So your role as an advocate for change is to start talking to your local elected officials and your local government officials, and also to just call DNR and see if they can help you initiate that conversation. There is also a federal emergency management policy piece called the Community Rating System. And although there is much grumbling on the Eastern Shore about the role of federal policy in almost anything, yeah, I heard somebody laugh, right? This is a program that actually recognizes communities that go above and beyond the bare minimum. And that recognition comes in the form of reduced, as I understand it, reduced premiums for federal emergency management insurance in low-lying areas. So good planning should result in more resilient communities, which should result in fewer claims, and the odds makers at FEMA are willing to back that by reducing the premiums. And that's a really powerful set of policies. And so there is also a note coming out of that session that there is a federal executive order issued last week that federal spending in coastal regions must take sea level rise into account. And so for any projects that the federal government has a finger in any of these low-lying districts, they are mandating this awareness, and that this is a way that they are going about mitigating risk at the national scale. So, and other things that came out of that talk, just some quick numbers, but again, 400,000 acres at Maryland are in Maryland are at risk, and that's about 1 million people who are going to be affected by this in the long run. In AUD 01, the conversation next door here, that was Drew Koslow's session. And Drew's session really focused in on a sort of decision-making at the local level and really drew a sharp contrast between what has gone before and what is happening now. And that is that in the past, we've always been sort of reactive in our decision-making. And when I walked into this room at some point, there was a conversation going on about the fact that in the past, we've waited for crises, and then we've reacted to them. And that the more current paradigm is to try and anticipate the events that will become crises, and in so doing, to help plan for and mitigate them at least a little bit in the advance. So instead of reacting and making decisions that may or may not be the best decisions for long-range planning in the past, we're actually starting to do that now. We're doing that in different scales across the state. I heard some talk that across the bridge on the Western Shore, there's a great effort to do this at sort of neighborhood by neighborhood scale. That's obviously a little more difficult, especially on the lower Eastern Shore, where neighborhoods are really spread out and there's a lot of empty space. And entire communities, rather than single neighborhoods, are the entity at risk. And we talked in that room about the role of property rights and how environmental protections have typically come at odds with property risk. And the conversation about that is starting to shift, that it's really going from a conflict between environmental protection and property rights to a discussion about public safety and property rights. That is, as the ocean comes up, the risk that used to be assumed by individual property holders is now being assumed by entire communities, and that's a powerful opportunity for shifting the dialogue a little bit. There's a great quote, I think, that I heard Drew say at some point, that the conversation opener in these communities really is now that forces beyond our control are really taking hold, and that those forces are really going to drive the conversation going forward. And then there was a lot of talk in that room about how to increase resiliency using various kinds of strategies, but the balance, and this mimics something that I heard in this session as well, the balance between using natural mitigation, oyster reefs, reconstructed marshes, versus the sort of artificial constructions, seawalls, breakwaters, riprap walls, things like that, the relative costs of the two. These are all factors that communities are going to need to consider going forward. Did I miss anything? All right, I'm getting a thumbs up, so I'm going to assume that that's all right. And the big thing, and I actually circled it on my sheet as I was sitting in there, is that there's a general consensus among the group here today anyway about the need for intelligent compromise on those fronts. Finally, in EDC 27, where Mark Konopelski was speaking, this was a really, really great session for those of you who didn't get a chance to hear it, about opportunities that arise as a result of crisis management. And there was a really, really shocking set of photographs. And the photographs ran the gamut from things that happened during Hurricane Sandy to what a good spring high tide looks like on Hooper's Island. And that's a real eye-opener. This is no longer an episodic event for some of the coastal islands. This is a regular event. And as Drew pointed out this morning in his intro, that's likely to become a regular event in places as civilized and as populated as Annapolis. Mr. Konopelski's talk focused in on the fact that they thought they were prepared, and that it takes a good crisis to shake you from that perception, to show you that your preparations needed to take another direction or assume other dimensions. And the translation of that crisis to opportunity is maybe a very short window. That right now, and with the way Mark wrapped up his talk, he said right now people are still talking about this, and the County Commission is making intelligent policy, and the Critical Areas Commission is trying hard to shape that policy. Some of this is now set in law and is no longer a matter of local decision making, it's a matter of legal compliance. But he did stress that unless we have another storm in the next 3 to 5 year window, that people's memories will begin to slip, and that we will question the need for these laws. So this, I think, points out the other conversation that I heard in all 3 rooms, which is the need for education, not just of the general public, certainly not just of the K through 12 population, but education of the electeds and the policyholders and the policymakers in these communities who need to be aware of the way that risk is changing, the way that coastlines are changing, and the way that those two things compound. Mark pointed out that there were $8.64 million poured into recovery in Crisfield, that an enormous amount of that, something on the order of about $5 million, has gone to recovery in the housing sector, but that was not evenly spread, and that there were folks who needed help who couldn't get it because of various criteria that were set. And that's a need to re-examine that set of policies and figure out how to make them work better for the communities they purport to serve. And I wanted to close my summary of the 3 with something Mark said that really stuck out to me. And he said Crisfield is a place set in time. And he said this by way of referring to the fact that change is hard for communities. And I think that's something that we all need to recognize. The state of Maryland is an old place, and we are rich in our cultural heritage. The Eastern Shore feels that very strongly. I don't want to pretend to speak for communities on the Western Shore, but I imagine they do as well. And the idea of change is difficult. However, the quote is usually attributed to Robert Kennedy, but we have the curse and the blessing of living in interesting times. Right? And so with that blessing comes the opportunity to start making changes in these communities that might allow them to persist and thereby protect the culture that we as Marylanders value. And that's going to be, I think, a very, very important dialogue going forward. I had the opportunity a while ago to watch a movie with my daughter. She's 10, and we have property in a little tiny house just outside of St. Michael's. And we are 1.21 meters above sea level. And in the movie we were watching, there's a horse ranch. And at some point, the protagonist turns to his 10-year-old daughter and says, "Someday this can all be yours." And I put the TV on pause, and I turned to my daughter and I said, "Don't count on it." And we had a long conversation. With a meter in sea level rise, my property will become uninhabitable. And much of the town that I have come to know and love, the town where I chose to live when I came to Maryland after a long exploration, is at risk. The culture that we like there is at risk, and the people that we know are going to be affected. This is the heart of community change. This is the heart of this conversation. And I'm fond of reminding my students that we got where we are. One decision, one farm, one homeowner, one automobile at a time. This is not the Gordian knot. This is not an insoluble mess. This is soluble. Today goes a long way towards laying out strategies that might help us become more resilient communities. It's my hope on my daughter's behalf and all of her friends and my children and their children that we'll figure out how to do this going forward. So thank you all for being here today and for helping us find solutions.